In a world where appearances can be deadly deceptive, one split-second decision would shatter everything a decorated military officer thought he knew about power, respect, and the hidden warriors walking among us. What happens when prejudice meets precision, when assumption collides with reality, and when a single punch reveals a truth so shocking it would change two lives forever? This is the story of Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a man whose military career was built on following orders and maintaining discipline, and Sergeant Riley Matthews, a woman whose secret identity as one of the Navy's most elite warriors was about to be exposed in the most unexpected way possible. In a crowded military bar on a Friday night, their worlds would collide with a force that neither training nor protocol could have prepared them for. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones you never see coming. Sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the one who will teach you the hardest lesson of your life. And, sometimes, one moment of violence reveals truths that were meant to stay buried forever. This is that story. The fluorescent lights of the Norfolk Naval Base cast harsh shadows across the administrative building as Lieutenant Marcus Chen straightened his uniform one final time before entering the weekly briefing room. At 32, Marcus had spent the last decade climbing the ranks through a combination of rigid discipline, unwavering loyalty to protocol, and an ironclad belief that respect was earned through rank and proven through action. His personnel file read like a textbook example of military excellence, decorated service records, commendations for leadership, and a reputation among his peers as someone who never bent the rules and never tolerated those who did. Marcus came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in Vietnam, and Marcus himself had done 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning stateside to take on administrative and training roles. The Chen family military tradition was built on honor, duty, and an unwavering belief that the chain of command existed for good reason. Marcus wore this heritage like armor, and it shaped every interaction he had with both subordinates and fellow officers. That Friday evening in late September, the base was winding down from another week of intensive training exercises. The autumn air carried the salt smell of the Chesapeake Bay, mixing with the diesel fumes from the motor pool and the ever-present aroma of military coffee that seemed to permeate every building on base. Marcus had finished his paperwork early and decided to join some fellow officers at Murphy's Tavern, a popular off-base establishment that served as an unofficial gathering place for military personnel from all branches of service. Murphy's was the kind of place where uniforms mixed with civilian clothes, where stories of deployment adventures were shared over beer and wings, and where the rigid hierarchy of military life relaxed just enough to allow for genuine camaraderie. The bar had been serving military personnel for over 20 years, its walls covered with patches, photographs, and memorabilia from units that had passed through Norfolk over the decades. The owner, a retired Marine named Tom Murphy, understood military culture and ran his establishment with the kind of respectful atmosphere that made it feel like neutral ground for service members looking to unwind. As Marcus entered Murphy's that evening, he immediately recognized several faces from base. The usual crowd was there, a mix of junior and senior enlisted personnel, junior officers like himself, and a few civilians who worked in various capacities on base. The atmosphere was relaxed but maintained the underlying current of mutual respect that characterized military social gatherings. Conversations flowed easily between tables, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter as someone shared a particularly amusing training story or deployment memory. Marcus ordered his usual, a beer and a burger, and settled into a booth with 3 other lieutenants from different departments. The conversation quickly turned to the upcoming annual training evaluation, a comprehensive assessment that would determine promotions and assignments for the following year. Marcus felt confident about his prospects, his recent performance reviews had been exemplary, and his commanding officer had hinted that a promotion to lieutenant commander might be in his future if he continued on his current trajectory. The evening progressed smoothly until around 9:30, when the atmosphere in Murphy's began to shift subtly. A group of younger sailors had occupied a table near the bar, and their conversation had grown progressively louder as the night wore on. Marcus observed them with the practiced eye of an officer accustomed to maintaining discipline, noting the telltale signs of personnel who had perhaps had one drink too many and were approaching the line between acceptable military bearing and conduct unbecoming. Among this group sat Sergeant Riley Matthews, though Marcus knew her only as a petite blonde woman in civilian clothes who appeared to be in her mid-20s. Riley had chosen to wear jeans and a simple black sweater that evening, clothing that gave no indication of her military affiliation or her extraordinary background. To the casual observer, she might have been anyone, a local college student, a civilian contractor, or perhaps someone's girlfriend who had joined the group for the evening. Her slight build and quiet demeanor made her nearly invisible among the more boisterous members of her table. What Marcus could not know, what no one in Murphy's that evening could know, was that Riley Matthews was one of the most highly trained warriors in the United States military. As a Navy SEAL, she belonged to an elite group of fewer than 24 women who had successfully completed the grueling training program that broke 90% of male candidates. Her official military occupational specialty was listed simply as Special Warfare Operator, a designation that revealed nothing about the classified missions she had completed in 3 different theaters of operation over the past 4 years. Riley's path to becoming a SEAL had been anything but conventional. Growing up in rural Montana as the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat, Riley had learned early that survival often depended on being underestimated. She was small for her age, quiet by nature, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into her surroundings. These qualities, which might have made her invisible in civilian life, proved to be tremendous assets when she enlisted in the Navy at 18. Her initial military occupation had been as a hospital corpsman, a role that taught her advanced medical skills while providing cover for her true ambitions. Riley had spent her off-duty hours in relentless physical training, pushing her body beyond what anyone thought possible for someone of her size. She studied combat tactics, practiced marksmanship until she could outshoot most of the men on base, and developed the mental toughness that would serve her well in SEAL training. When the opportunity arose for women to attempt SEAL qualification, Riley was among the first to volunteer. The training had been more brutal than anything she had imagined, months of physical and mental punishment designed to identify and eliminate anyone who lacked the absolute commitment required for special warfare operations. Of the 12 women who began the program with her, only Riley and 2 others had graduated. Even among her SEAL teammates, her small stature and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her capabilities, a misconception she had learned to use to her tactical advantage. The nature of special operations required Riley to maintain her anonymity even on base. Her official assignment was listed as Administrative Support for Naval Special Warfare Command, a deliberately vague designation that allowed her to come and go without attracting attention. Most personnel at Norfolk knew nothing about the SEAL program's female operators, and Riley preferred it that way. Anonymity was a form of protection, both for herself and for the classified nature of her work. That evening at Murphy's, Riley was simply trying to relax with a few friends from her cover assignment. The stress of maintaining her dual identity was constant, always being careful about what she said, always monitoring her physical reactions to ensure she did not inadvertently reveal her training. Even simple activities like arm wrestling or casual sparring could expose her conditioning, so she had learned to appear weaker and less capable than she actually was. The conversation at Riley's table had indeed grown louder, but not because of alcohol consumption. Her companions were discussing a recent news story about women in combat roles, a topic that always generated passionate debate among military personnel. Riley found herself in the uncomfortable position of listening to opinions about her own capabilities without being able to reveal her true identity or defend her fellow female warriors. She had developed a thick skin about such conversations, understanding that changing minds required more than arguments, it required proof. As the evening progressed, the debate at Riley's table attracted attention from other patrons, including Marcus and his fellow officers. Marcus listened with growing irritation as he heard what he perceived to be a group of junior enlisted personnel discussing policy matters that he felt were above their pay grade. His military upbringing had instilled in him a strong belief in the importance of hierarchy and proper channels for such discussions. The catalyst for what would happen next came when one of the sailors at Riley's table, emboldened by the evening's consumption and the passionate nature of the debate, made a particularly crude comment about women's physical limitations in combat situations. The comment was loud enough to be heard throughout the bar, and Riley's jaw tightened as she fought to control her reaction. Years of training had taught her to maintain her cover at all costs, but the blatant disrespect touched a nerve that was difficult to ignore. Marcus, observing the situation from across the room, made a decision that would change everything. In his mind, he was seeing a group of junior personnel who had lost sight of proper military bearing and were creating a disturbance that reflected poorly on all military personnel in the establishment. His sense of duty, combined with his belief in the importance of maintaining standards, compelled him to act. Rising from his booth, Marcus straightened his civilian jacket and walked deliberately toward Riley's table. His fellow officers watched with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing the look of determination that indicated their friend was about to exercise his authority in an unofficial capacity. The other patrons in Murphy's began to take notice as well, sensing the change in atmosphere that preceded most military confrontations. Riley saw Marcus approaching before her companions did, her situational awareness finely tuned by years of combat training. She recognized the purposeful stride, the set of his shoulders, and the expression that marked him as an officer preparing to assert his authority. Every instinct told her that trouble was approaching, but her cover identity required her to remain in character as a civilian who would be intimidated by military authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose secrets, challenge assumptions, and force both individuals to confront truths about themselves and each other that neither was prepared to face. In a few moments, Lieutenant Marcus Chen would make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, and Sergeant Riley Matthews would be forced to choose between maintaining her cover and defending her honor in a way that would change everything. Marcus approached Riley's table with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to having his authority respected without question. The conversations around him seemed to dim as other patrons sensed the tension building in the air. Murphy's had seen its share of military confrontations over the years, but there was something different about this moment, an electricity that made even the most seasoned veterans pause their conversations to watch. When Marcus reached the table, he positioned himself so that he could address the entire group while maintaining a clear line of sight to the exit, a tactical habit that had been drilled into him during his combat deployments. His posture was textbook military bearing, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, hands clasped behind his back in a modified parade rest position. To anyone observing, it was clear that an officer was about to address subordinates, and the expected response was immediate attention and respect. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice carrying the particular tone that officers used when they were attempting to maintain civility while making their displeasure known. "I couldn't help but notice that your discussion has become rather animated. As military personnel, even when we're off duty, we have a responsibility to maintain certain standards of conduct that reflect well on our service." The reaction at Riley's table was immediate and varied. Two of the sailors straightened instinctively, recognizing Officer Bering even without seeing uniform insignia. Another looked confused, clearly having had enough to drink that the subtleties of military protocol were beyond his current comprehension. The fourth member of the group, a young woman named Jennifer who worked in base communications, shot an embarrassed glance toward Riley, recognizing that their evening was about to take an unpleasant turn. Riley herself remained perfectly still, her training allowing her to assess the situation with clinical detachment even as her pulse quickened. Marcus was clearly a commissioned officer, probably a lieutenant based on his age and bearing. He was also clearly someone who took his authority seriously and expected immediate compliance with his directives. Most concerning to Riley was the realization that this confrontation could spiral quickly into something that would force her to break cover or submit to treatment that no SEAL should have to endure. "Sir," one of the sailors began, attempting to defuse the situation, "we weren't trying to cause any problems. We were just having a conversation about current events." Marcus nodded curtly, his expression suggesting that he appreciated the sailor's attempt at courtesy but was not entirely satisfied with the explanation. "Current events is one thing," he replied, "but when that conversation involves inappropriate comments about military personnel and becomes loud enough to disturb other patrons, it crosses a line. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining the reputation of our service, even in civilian establishments." The rebuke was delivered with the kind of measured authority that Marcus had perfected over years of leadership roles. It was firm without being harsh, educational without being humiliating, and designed to correct behavior while maintaining the dignity of all involved. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an appropriate exercise of military authority, the kind of informal counseling that helped maintain unit cohesion and proper standards. But these were not normal circumstances, and Riley Matthews was far from a typical service member requiring guidance from a superior officer. As Marcus spoke, she found herself analyzing his technique with the detached professionalism of someone who had been trained to assess leadership styles and tactical approaches. His positioning was solid, his tone appropriate, and his message clear. Under different circumstances, she might have respected his intervention. However, as Marcus continued his impromptu lecture, his attention began to focus more specifically on Riley. Perhaps it was her civilian clothing that made her seem out of place among the military personnel, or perhaps it was her small stature and quiet demeanor that suggested to him that she might be the civilian girlfriend of one of the sailors. Whatever the reason, Marcus began to direct his comments more toward her than to the group as a whole. "Miss," Marcus said, turning to address Riley directly, "I'm not sure what your connection is to this group, but you should understand that when you associate with military personnel in public, your behavior reflects on all of us. The comments and attitudes expressed at this table tonight have been inappropriate and unprofessional." The assumption implicit in his words hit Riley like a physical blow. Marcus had looked at her small frame, her civilian clothes, and her youth, and had concluded that she was not military personnel herself but rather some kind of camp follower whose presence was somehow contributing to the decline in military standards at the table. It was exactly the kind of prejudicial thinking that Riley had encountered throughout her career, but never so blatantly or with such condescending authority. Riley felt the familiar surge of anger that had driven her through SEAL training, the same fury that had sustained her through missions where enemy combatants had underestimated her until it was far too late. But her training also kicked in, the disciplines that had been hammered into her during countless hours of instruction in maintaining operational security. Revealing her true identity to win an argument with an arrogant officer was exactly the kind of ego-driven mistake that could compromise years of careful cover building. "Sir," Riley replied carefully, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "I think there might be some misunderstanding about the situation." Marcus interpreted her response as either evasion or disrespect, neither of which improved his opinion of her role in the evening's events. "The only misunderstanding," he replied, his tone growing sharper, "is the failure of everyone at this table to recognize that military bearing doesn't end when you leave base. Your presence here, encouraging this kind of unprofessional behavior, shows a complete lack of respect for the uniform and everything it represents." The accusation was so far from reality that Riley almost laughed despite her anger. She had spent the better part of 4 years defending everything the uniform represented in ways that Marcus could not imagine and in places that would remain classified for decades to come. She had bled for the values he was lecturing her about, had lost friends defending the principles he claimed she did not understand. But what pushed the confrontation beyond the point of verbal resolution was Marcus's next action. Apparently deciding that his words were not having sufficient impact, he reached out and placed his hand firmly on Riley's shoulder, intending to emphasize his authority and ensure that she was paying proper attention to his instructions. The moment Marcus made physical contact, Riley's body reacted with reflexes honed by thousands of hours of combat training. His touch triggered automatic responses that had been conditioned into her muscle memory during scenarios where unexpected contact meant life or death. For a split second, she had to fight every instinct in her body to prevent herself from executing a disabling counterattack that would have ended the confrontation immediately. But Marcus, emboldened by what he interpreted as submission to his authority, decided to drive his point home more forcefully. "When an officer is speaking to you," he said, tightening his grip on her shoulder, "the appropriate response is attention and respect, not attitude and evasion." The combination of his words and his physical assertion of dominance pushed Riley past the point where operational security concerns could override her training and her pride. When Marcus's grip became painful and his tone shifted from corrective to threatening, she made a decision that would expose her true identity but preserve something more important than cover, her honor as a warrior who had earned the right to respect through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. "Sir," Riley said, her voice dropping to the deadly calm tone that her SEAL teammates recognized as a warning sign, "I need you to remove your hand from my shoulder. Now." Marcus, misinterpreting her controlled response as continued defiance, made the most catastrophic mistake of his military career. Instead of recognizing the dangerous stillness in her voice, instead of noticing the way other patrons had begun to step back from their confrontation, instead of observing the subtle shift in her posture that marked the transition from civilian to warrior, he doubled down on his assertion of authority. I'll remove my hand when I'm satisfied that you understand the gravity of this situation, Marcus replied, his own voice rising with frustration and wounded pride. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Marcus, believing that he needed to make a more dramatic demonstration of his authority, drew back his free hand and delivered what he intended to be a controlled slap designed to shock Riley into compliance and respect. The blow never landed as intended. As Marcus's hand moved toward her face, Riley's combat reflexes finally overrode her operational considerations. Her hand intercepted his wrist with lightning precision, redirecting his momentum and setting up a counterattack that 4 years of special warfare training had made automatic. The throw that followed was textbook close-quarters combat, executed with the kind of mechanical perfection that only came from endless repetition under stress. Marcus found himself airborne for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his mind struggling to process how a small civilian woman had just executed a combat technique that he had only seen performed by special operations personnel. When he hit the floor of Murphy's Tavern, the impact drove the breath from his lungs and scattered his thoughts like leaves in a hurricane wind. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Every conversation in the bar stopped simultaneously as patrons tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The young woman who had appeared to be nothing more than a civilian girlfriend had just thrown a military officer across the room with a technique that spoke of professional training and extensive experience. Riley stood over Marcus's prone form, her breathing controlled and her posture balanced, ready for his next move. The transformation was startling to anyone who had been watching the entire confrontation. Gone was the quiet, unassuming woman in civilian clothes, replaced by someone whose bearing and readiness marked her unmistakably as a professional warrior. Marcus struggled to his feet, his pride wounded more severely than his body, his mind racing to understand what had just occurred. The woman standing before him bore no resemblance to the person he had been lecturing moments before. Her stance, her expression, her entire presence had shifted into something that every combat veteran in Murphy's recognized immediately. The confrontation had crossed a line from which there would be no return, and both Riley and Marcus realized that the rest of their evening, and possibly their careers, would be shaped by what happened in the next few minutes. The secret that Riley had protected so carefully was now exposed to a room full of military personnel, and Marcus was facing the devastating realization that every assumption he had made about the situation had been catastrophically wrong. The silence in Murphy's Tavern stretched into what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Marcus Chen lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling while his mind struggled to process what had just happened. His vision was slightly blurred from where his head had impacted the floor, but what confused him more than any physical discomfort was the complete impossibility of what he had just experienced. Riley Matthews stood exactly where she had been when she executed the throw, her breathing steady and her posture suggesting that she was ready for whatever might come next. The transformation in her demeanor was so complete that several patrons later claimed they thought a different person had somehow taken her place. Gone entirely was the quiet, unassuming woman who had been sitting peacefully at her table. In her place stood someone whose bearing and readiness marked her unmistakably as a combat veteran. Tom Murphy, the establishment's owner and a retired Marine with 30 years of experience reading military personnel, moved slowly from behind the bar toward the confrontation. His instincts told him that this situation was unlike anything he had seen in 2 decades of running a military hangout. The technique he had just witnessed was not the kind of self-defense move that someone learned in a weekend seminar or picked up from watching movies. It was textbook close-quarters combat, executed with the precision and automatic response that came only from extensive professional training under stress. Marcus slowly got to his feet, his pride stinging more than his bruised ribs. As he stood, he found himself looking directly into Riley's eyes for the first time since the confrontation began, and what he saw there shook him more than the physical throw had. Her gaze was steady, professional, and completely lacking in the fear or submission that he had expected to see from a civilian who had just assaulted a military officer. "Ma'am," Tom Murphy said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was trying to defuse a potentially explosive situation, "I think we all need to take a step back and figure out what just happened here." Riley turned her attention to the bar owner while maintaining her peripheral awareness of Marcus and the other patrons who were slowly beginning to move closer to the confrontation. "Mr. Murphy," she replied, her voice calm and respectful, "I apologize for the disturbance in your establishment." The situation escalated beyond what any of us intended. Her response was perfect military courtesy, acknowledging the civilian authority while accepting responsibility without admitting wrongdoing. It was the kind of response that came from years of dealing with complex situations where military and civilian jurisdictions overlapped. Marcus recognized the pattern of her words even as he struggled to understand how a young civilian woman possessed such sophisticated understanding of military protocol. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the sailors who had been sitting at Riley's table, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and confusion. "Riley, what the hell was that?" The use of her first name seemed to break some kind of spell that had held the room motionless. Conversations resumed in hushed tones as patrons tried to make sense of what they had witnessed while Marcus continued to stare at Riley with growing awareness that nothing about this situation was what it had appeared to be. "Lieutenant," Riley said, addressing Marcus directly for the first time with his proper rank, "I believe we need to discuss what just happened." The fact that she had correctly identified his rank despite his civilian clothes sent another shock through Marcus's already reeling sense of reality. He had introduced himself to no one in the bar that evening, and his civilian clothes bore no insignia or indication of his military status. Yet this woman, whom he had assumed to be a civilian, not only knew his rank but was addressing him with the proper military courtesy. "How do you know my rank?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a mixture of suspicion and growing unease about the direction this confrontation was taking. Riley's slight smile held no warmth, but it carried something that Marcus was beginning to recognize as professional respect tinged with disappointment. "Bearing, posture, age, and the way you approached our table," she replied. "You carry yourself like an officer with about 10 years of service, probably Army or Navy based on your haircut and the way you address enlisted personnel. Your assumption of authority and your intervention technique suggests someone in a leadership position but not yet senior enough to have learned the subtleties of when not to intervene." The analysis was delivered in the same tone that Marcus had heard from senior non-commissioned officers during his early career, professional assessment without malice but with the kind of insight that came from extensive experience reading military personnel. It was not the voice of a civilian who had gotten lucky with a self-defense technique. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the answer would be more shocking than anything he was prepared to hear. Before Riley could respond, another voice cut through the tension in the room. "She's Petty Officer First Class Riley Matthews, Naval Special Warfare Command," said a tall man who had just entered Murphy's and was surveying the scene with the kind of professional interest that marked him as someone accustomed to dealing with unusual situations. Master Chief Petty Officer David Rodriguez was Riley's immediate supervisor in her cover assignment, though like everyone else at Norfolk, he was unaware of her true role as a SEAL operator. What he did know was that Riley Matthews was one of the most professional and competent petty officers he had ever supervised, and seeing her involved in a confrontation with an officer was so contrary to her normal behavior that he suspected there was more to the situation than met the eye. "Master Chief," Riley said, coming to attention with the automatic response of a service member acknowledging a superior, though Marcus noticed that her positioning still allowed her to react quickly if the situation deteriorated further. Rodriguez nodded to Riley before turning his attention to Marcus. "Lieutenant Chen, isn't it?" he said, extending his hand in greeting. "I believe we were introduced at the quarterly inter-service briefing last month." Marcus shook the offered hand automatically while his mind raced to understand the implications of what he was learning. Riley was not a civilian girlfriend or camp follower as he had assumed, but an active duty Navy petty officer. The realization hit him like a physical blow as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. "Master Chief Rodriguez," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady as the full implications of the situation began to sink in. "There seems to have been some kind of misunderstanding." Rodriguez's expression suggested that he was reaching similar conclusions about the nature of the misunderstanding, and none of those conclusions reflected well on Marcus's judgment or behavior. "Petty Officer Matthews," he said, turning back to Riley, "would you mind explaining what led to this confrontation?" Riley's response was a masterpiece of military reporting, concise, factual, and completely free of editorial comment or emotional language. She described Marcus's approach to their table, his assumption that she was a civilian, his physical contact without permission, and his attempt to strike her. What she did not mention was the specific training that had allowed her to respond as she had, maintaining her operational security even while providing a complete account of the incident. As Riley spoke, Marcus felt his career flash before his eyes. Every word of her report was technically accurate, and every action she described reflected poorly on his judgment and professionalism. He had physically assaulted a subordinate based on assumptions about her military status and her right to be present in the establishment. Even if Riley were actually a civilian, his behavior would have been inappropriate. The fact that she was active duty military personnel made his actions potentially criminal. Lieutenant Chen, Rodriguez said when Riley finished her report, "Is Petty Officer Matthews's account accurate?" Marcus wanted to explain the context, to describe the behavior at the table that had prompted his intervention, to justify his actions based on his understanding of the situation. But, looking at the faces around him, seeing the professional disappointment in Rodriguez's expression and the carefully controlled anger in Riley's eyes, he realized that no explanation would excuse what he had done. "Yes, Master Chief," Marcus replied quietly. "Her account is accurate." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus had just acknowledged that he had physically assaulted a subordinate based on incorrect assumptions about her status and her right to be present in a civilian establishment. The fact that she had defended herself successfully did not change the nature of his actions or the potential consequences he was facing. But, as shocking as the revelation of Riley's military status had been, Marcus was about to learn that his mistakes were far more catastrophic than he had imagined. Rodriguez was studying Riley with the kind of professional interest that suggested he was seeing aspects of her background that he had not previously understood. "Petty Officer Matthews," Rodriguez said carefully, "that technique you used was not standard Navy hand-to-hand combat training. Where did you learn to execute a throw like that?" Riley's hesitation was barely noticeable, but Marcus caught it, and he sensed that the answer to Rodriguez's question would reveal even more shocking truths about the woman he had so drastically underestimated. "Master Chief," Riley said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to reveal information that would change everything, "my actual assignment classification is Naval Special Warfare Operator. The administrative position listed in my base records is a cover assignment." The words hit the room like a bomb blast. Rodriguez's eyes widened as he processed the implications, while Marcus felt his knees buckle slightly as he realized the full magnitude of what he had just learned. Riley Matthews was not just a Navy petty officer whom he had misjudged and assaulted. She was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the United States military, trained in ways that Marcus could barely comprehend and experienced in combat situations that remained classified at the highest levels of government. Marcus had not just assaulted a subordinate. He had assaulted a special operations warrior whose training and experience far exceeded his own, whose service to their country had involved sacrifices and risks that he would never fully understand. The silence that followed Riley's revelation was profound and complete. Every person in Murphy's Tavern who had heard her words was trying to process the impossible reality that the small, quiet woman who had been sitting peacefully at a corner table was actually one of the most dangerous and highly trained warriors in the world. And Marcus Chen, a lieutenant who prided himself on his military bearing and his respect for the chain of command, had just learned that his prejudices and assumptions had led him to commit an assault against someone whose dedication to service made his own look pale by comparison. The revelation that Riley Matthews was a Navy SEAL transformed the atmosphere in Murphy's Tavern from shocked silence to something approaching reverence. Even in a room full of military personnel, SEAL operators commanded a special level of respect that transcended normal rank structures. These were the warriors who undertook the most dangerous missions, who trained to standards that broke most candidates, and who served in roles that remained classified long after other military operations became public knowledge. Master Chief Rodriguez was the first to find his voice, though his words came slowly as he processed the implications of what Riley had just revealed. "Petty Officer Matthews," he said, his tone shifting to reflect his new understanding of her background, "how long have you been assigned to Naval Special Warfare?" "For years, Master Chief," Riley replied, maintaining her military bearing despite the chaos of emotions that Marcus could see flickering behind her professional facade. "I completed BUD/S training with Class 347 and have been operational since my graduation." The reference to BUD/S training sent another shock wave through the military personnel who were close enough to hear the conversation. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training was legendary throughout the military for its brutality and its failure rate. The fact that Riley had not only survived but graduated from a program that eliminated 90% of candidates marked her as extraordinary even among elite military personnel. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he finally understood the full scope of his mistakes. He had not simply misjudged a civilian or even assaulted a junior enlisted person. He had physically attacked one of the most highly trained warriors in the United States military, someone whose dedication to service and personal sacrifice far exceeded anything he had ever experienced. The weight of his actions settled on him like a physical burden. Every assumption he had made, every prejudice that had driven his behavior, every moment of arrogance that had led him to believe he had the right to put his hands on another person, all of it crashed down on him with devastating clarity. "Son of a bitch," whispered one of the sailors from Riley's table, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Riley, we had no idea. I mean, we knew you were different, but we thought you were just really good at your admin job." Riley's slight smile carried no malice, but it held a weariness that spoke of years spent hiding her true capabilities from people who would never understand the burden of maintaining such a demanding cover. "The nature of special operations requires operational security," she replied. "Very few people are supposed to know what I actually do." Rodriguez nodded slowly, his mind already working through the implications of this incident for both Riley's career and the broader security considerations involved. "Petty Officer Matthews, I assume your chain of command will need to be notified about this incident?" "Yes, Master Chief," Riley confirmed. "Any compromise of operational security, even accidental, requires immediate reporting through special warfare channels." Marcus realized with growing horror that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond his own career. Riley's cover assignment had been compromised, potentially affecting ongoing operations and requiring adjustments to security protocols that could impact missions he would never know about. "Lieutenant Chen," Rodriguez said, turning his attention back to Marcus with an expression that conveyed both professional disappointment and personal disgust, "I think you need to understand the full implications of what happened here tonight." Marcus nodded numbly, though he suspected that his understanding was still far from complete. The military justice system took assault charges seriously under any circumstances, but when the victim was a special operations personnel whose identity had been compromised as a result of the incident, the consequences would be severe and career-ending. "Master Chief," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea. I thought she was a civilian who was encouraging inappropriate behavior from military personnel. I was trying to maintain standards and preserve the reputation of the service." The explanation sounded pathetic even to Marcus as he spoke the words. Rodriguez's expression made it clear that the Master Chief found the justification inadequate and the underlying assumptions inexcusable. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a senior non-commissioned officer addressing an officer who had failed to meet basic standards of leadership, "let me see if I understand your reasoning. You observed behavior that you deemed inappropriate, made assumptions about the military status of the people involved, decided to intervene without understanding the situation, escalated to physical contact when your authority was questioned, and then attempted to strike a service member who had done nothing more than ask you to remove your hand from her shoulder." Each point in Rodriguez's summary hit Marcus like a physical blow. Laid out in sequence, his actions revealed a pattern of poor judgment, prejudicial thinking, and abuse of authority that violated every principle of military leadership he had been taught. But Rodriguez was not finished with his analysis. "More troubling than your specific actions, Lieutenant, is the thinking that led to them. You saw a small woman in civilian clothes and assumed she had no right to be present during a military discussion. You assumed that her size and gender meant she was not military personnel herself. You assumed that your rank gave you the authority to physically discipline someone you believed to be a civilian. Every one of those assumptions reveals thinking that has no place in a modern military officer." The indictment was devastating because it was accurate. Marcus had indeed made every one of those assumptions, and each one had been based on prejudices that he had never examined or questioned. His military upbringing had taught him to respect hierarchy and maintain standards, but it had also instilled in him biases about gender, size, and authority that had led him to this catastrophic moment. Riley had remained silent during Rodriguez's critique of Marcus's behavior, but now she stepped forward with the bearing of someone who had made a difficult decision. "Master Chief," she said, I request permission to speak privately with Lieutenant Chen. Rodriguez looked surprised by the request, as did several of the other military personnel who were close enough to hear the conversation. Under normal circumstances, a victim of assault would have no reason to request private conversation with their attacker, and the request suggested that Riley had something specific in mind. Petty Officer Matthews, Rodriguez said carefully, "Are you sure that's appropriate under the circumstances?" "Yes, Master Chief," Riley replied firmly. "I believe Lieutenant Chen and I need to have a conversation that will be beneficial for both of us and for the service more broadly." Rodriguez studied Riley's face for a long moment, clearly trying to understand what she had in mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. You have 5 minutes, and I'll be right here if you need anything." Riley turned to Marcus with an expression that was impossible to read. "Lieutenant Chen," she said formally, "would you step outside with me for a moment?" Marcus followed Riley toward the rear exit of Murphy's Tavern, his mind racing with uncertainty about what she intended to say to him. The cool night air hit his face as they stepped into the small parking area behind the building, providing a stark contrast to the overheated atmosphere they had just left. Riley positioned herself where she could see both the door they had just exited and the alley that led back to the main street, a tactical awareness that Marcus now understood came from years of training in threat assessment and situational awareness. When she turned to face him, her expression was serious but not hostile. "Lieutenant Chen," she began, "what happened tonight was a series of mistakes that escalated beyond what either of us intended. I want you to understand something important about the situation before this goes any further." Marcus waited, unsure of what Riley was planning to tell him but certain that it would be significant. "I could have stopped you at any point during that confrontation," Riley continued, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "From the moment you approached our table, I was aware that you were military, that you were acting in an unofficial capacity, and that you had made incorrect assumptions about the situation. I could have identified myself immediately and avoided the entire confrontation." The revelation surprised Marcus, though it also made perfect sense given Riley's background and training. A SEAL operator would certainly have the situational awareness and tactical knowledge to recognize and defuse a confrontation before it became physical. "Why didn't you?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. Riley's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how to answer his question. "Because I wanted to see how far your assumptions would take you," she replied honestly. "I wanted to understand whether you were the kind of officer who would escalate a situation based on prejudice, or whether you would recognize when you were operating on insufficient information." The answer stung because it revealed that Riley had been evaluating his character and leadership throughout the confrontation, and he had failed her test completely. She had given him multiple opportunities to reconsider his approach, and he had instead chosen to escalate at every turn. "I failed your test," Marcus said quietly, the admission carrying the weight of his growing understanding of his own limitations. "You did," Riley agreed, though her tone was not unkind. "But failure is only permanent if you choose not to learn from it. What you do next will determine whether tonight was a career-ending mistake or a learning experience that makes you a better officer." Marcus looked at Riley with new respect, recognizing that despite being the victim of his assault, she was offering him something that few people in her position would consider providing, a chance at redemption. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine humility for the first time since the confrontation began. Riley studied him carefully before responding, clearly weighing her words with the same precision she brought to tactical planning. "That depends on what kind of officer you want to be, Lieutenant Chen. Tonight you showed me that you make assumptions based on appearance, that you escalate situations when your authority is questioned, and that you're willing to use physical force when you feel disrespected. Those are serious character flaws that will limit your effectiveness as a leader." Marcus nodded, accepting the harsh but accurate assessment of his behavior. "But," Riley continued, "you also showed that you care about military standards and are willing to intervene when you believe the service is being disrespected. Those are valuable qualities if they're guided by wisdom and humility rather than prejudice and arrogance." The conversation was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Riley was simultaneously holding him accountable for his mistakes while offering him a path toward becoming a better person and a better officer. It was the kind of leadership that he had read about in military history books but had rarely encountered in practice. "How do I become that better officer?" Marcus asked, and the question came from a place of genuine desire to change rather than mere damage control. Riley's slight smile suggested that his question was exactly what she had hoped to hear. "That's a conversation that will take much longer than 5 minutes," she replied. "But, if you're serious about learning, I think we can find a way to turn tonight's disaster into something constructive." 6 months after the confrontation at Murphy's Tavern, Lieutenant Marcus Chen stood in front of his commanding officer's desk, reviewing a fitness report that would have seemed impossible on that fateful Friday night when his world had collapsed around him. The efficiency report praised his leadership growth, his enhanced understanding of diversity and inclusion principles, and his development of what was described as exceptional mentoring capabilities with junior personnel from diverse backgrounds. The transformation had not been easy or quick, but it had been profound and genuine. In the days immediately following the incident at Murphy's, Marcus had faced the very real possibility of court-martial, administrative separation from the Navy, and the permanent destruction of his military career. The assault charges alone would have been sufficient to end his commission, but the circumstances surrounding the incident, particularly the compromise of Riley's operational security, had elevated the severity of potential consequences to career-ending levels. However, Riley Matthews had chosen a different path forward, one that surprised everyone involved in the incident and demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made her exceptional even among SEAL operators. Rather than pursuing maximum punishment for Marcus's behavior, Riley had requested permission to implement what she termed a corrective action program that would address the underlying issues that had led to the confrontation while preserving the possibility of salvaging a military career that still had potential for positive contribution to the service. The program that Riley designed was more challenging than any punishment the military justice system could have imposed. It required Marcus to confront not only his actions on that night but the assumptions, prejudices, and character flaws that had made those actions possible. Over the course of 6 months, Marcus had been required to undergo intensive counseling focused on unconscious bias and gender dynamics in military settings, complete additional training on proper use of authority and de-escalation techniques, and, most challenging of all, serve as an aide to Riley herself in her cover assignment at Naval Special Warfare Command. Working directly for Riley had been a humbling experience that had forced Marcus to confront the gap between his assumptions about military capability and the reality of what elite warriors actually look like. Riley's daily routine included physical training that left Marcus struggling to keep pace, tactical planning sessions that operated at a level of sophistication he had never encountered, and operational briefings that reminded him constantly that his understanding of military service had been embarrassingly narrow. But, beyond the professional education, working with Riley had taught Marcus something more fundamental about leadership and respect. He had watched her interact with personnel from every branch of service and every level of rank, and he had observed how she earned respect through competence, integrity, and genuine concern for others rather than through force of authority or intimidation. Her leadership style was consultative rather than directive, collaborative rather than hierarchical, and consistently effective in ways that Marcus's more traditional approach had never achieved. The most challenging aspect of the corrective action program had been what Riley termed assumption auditing, a daily practice that required Marcus to examine his initial reactions to people and situations, identify the assumptions underlying those reactions, and develop more accurate assessments based on observable evidence rather than prejudicial thinking. The exercise had revealed to Marcus how frequently his judgments were based on factors like gender, age, physical appearance, and perceived social status rather than on actual capability or character. One particularly significant moment in Marcus's transformation had occurred during a joint training exercise involving personnel from multiple military branches. Marcus had observed a young female Marine who appeared to be struggling with the physical demands of the exercise and had instinctively moved to offer assistance. Riley had quietly redirected his attention to the Marine's tactical performance, which was actually superior to most of her male counterparts, and had helped Marcus understand that his assumption about her physical struggles had been based on stereotypes rather than observation. The incident had been a microcosm of the thinking patterns that had led to the confrontation at Murphy's. Marcus had seen what he expected to see rather than what was actually happening, and he had acted on those expectations in ways that were both unhelpful and potentially insulting to a competent professional who needed no assistance. As Marcus's understanding of these dynamics deepened, he had begun to recognize similar patterns in other officers throughout his command. He had observed countless instances of female personnel being overlooked for challenging assignments, minority service members being subjected to different standards of evaluation, and junior personnel being dismissed or ignored based on assumptions about their capabilities rather than assessments of their actual performance. This growing awareness had led Marcus to request permission to develop and present training programs focused on inclusive leadership and unconscious bias recognition. His initial presentations had been awkward and clearly the product of someone still learning the material, but Riley's coaching and his own commitment to improvement had gradually transformed him into an effective educator on topics that had once been completely foreign to his thinking. The irony was not lost on Marcus that he had become the kind of officer he had initially resented, someone who challenged traditional assumptions about military culture and pushed for more inclusive approaches to leadership and personnel management. But the transformation felt authentic rather than imposed because it had grown from his direct experience of seeing his own prejudices exposed and proven wrong. Riley's mentorship had extended beyond professional development to personal growth that had improved every aspect of Marcus's life. She had introduced him to meditation and mindfulness practices that helped him manage the quick temper and defensive reactions that had characterized his earlier leadership style. She had recommended books and articles that challenged his assumptions about leadership, authority, and respect, expanding his understanding beyond the narrow military tradition he had inherited from his family. Most importantly, Riley had taught Marcus to see military service as something larger than adherence to hierarchy and protocol. Through her example, he had learned to understand service as a commitment to something greater than oneself, a dedication to protecting and serving others that required constant growth, self-examination, and humility in the face of challenges that demanded the best from every service member regardless of their background or appearance. The changes in Marcus's approach to leadership had not gone unnoticed by his superiors or his subordinates. His commanding officer had noted marked improvements in unit morale and performance in areas under Marcus's supervision, particularly among female and minority personnel who had previously seemed disengaged or underutilized. His peers had observed his transformation from someone who commanded through authority to someone who led through inspiration and genuine concern for the development of others. But, perhaps most significantly, Marcus had begun to understand what Riley had tried to tell him during their conversation behind Murphy's Tavern about the difference between leadership that was based on position and leadership that was earned through character and competence. He had learned to recognize that true authority came not from rank or tradition but from the ability to inspire others to perform beyond what they believed possible, to create environments where everyone could contribute their best efforts regardless of their background or appearance. The fitness report that Marcus reviewed on this particular morning contained a note from his commanding officer requesting his input on the development of service-wide training programs focused on inclusive leadership and bias recognition. It was an opportunity that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, when Marcus had been facing potential court-martial for assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. That afternoon, Marcus made his way to Riley's office for their weekly mentoring session, a continuation of the corrective action program that had now evolved into genuine friendship and mutual professional respect. Riley had been promoted to Chief Petty Officer in recognition of her exceptional service and was preparing for deployment to a classified location where she would serve as a liaison between special operations units and conventional forces. "Good afternoon, Chief Matthews," Marcus said as he entered her office, using the formal address that maintained proper military protocol while acknowledging their transformed relationship. "Afternoon, Lieutenant Chen," Riley replied, looking up from a tactical manual she had been reviewing. "I understand you received some interesting feedback in your fitness report today." Marcus nodded, still somewhat amazed by how completely his career trajectory had changed since that night at Murphy's. "The commanding officer wants me to develop service-wide training programs. 6 months ago, I was facing court-martial for assaulting a subordinate. Today, I'm being asked to teach other officers about inclusive leadership." Riley's smile carried both satisfaction and genuine pride in Marcus's transformation. "That's what redemption looks like, Lieutenant. Not the absence of consequences, but the transformation of mistakes into wisdom that benefits others. I wanted to thank you again for giving me the chance to learn rather than simply punishing me for my mistakes," Marcus said, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who understood how drastically different his life could have been. "You earned that chance through your willingness to change," Riley replied. I've seen officers who made similar mistakes but refused to examine the thinking that led to them. They didn't learn because they weren't willing to accept that their assumptions might be wrong. Marcus nodded, understanding now that Riley's decision to offer him redemption rather than destruction had been based on her assessment of his character and his potential for growth. She had seen something in him that he had not seen in himself, a capacity for transformation that had required the right circumstances to emerge. "What's next for you, Chief?" Marcus asked, knowing that Riley's deployment would mark the end of their formal mentoring relationship. "That's classified," Riley replied with a slight smile, "but I can tell you that the work we've done together on inclusive leadership will be valuable in my new assignment. Special operations increasingly requires effective collaboration between personnel from diverse backgrounds, and the principles we've developed here will be applicable in environments where traditional hierarchy is less important than mission effectiveness." Marcus realized that their work together had benefited Riley as much as it had benefited him. Teaching him about inclusive leadership had helped her develop skills that would be valuable in her ongoing career as a special operations professional, creating a symbiotic relationship that had strengthened both of their capabilities. As their meeting concluded, Marcus reflected on how completely his understanding of military service had been transformed. 6 months earlier, he had seen the military as a hierarchical institution where respect flowed upward and authority flowed downward, where tradition and protocol were more important than individual capability, and where maintaining standards meant preserving existing power structures regardless of their effectiveness. Now he understood military service as a collaborative effort where the best ideas and most effective approaches could come from anyone regardless of their rank or background, where true leadership meant creating environments where everyone could contribute their unique strengths to mission accomplishment, and where maintaining standards meant constantly evolving to ensure that the service attracted and retained the best people from all segments of society. The transformation had been painful but ultimately liberating. Marcus had discovered that letting go of his prejudices and assumptions had not made him a weaker leader but a stronger one, not less respected but more effective, not less military but more true to the highest ideals of service and sacrifice that had originally drawn him to military life. Walking back to his office after the meeting with Riley, Marcus encountered several junior officers who greeted him with the kind of genuine respect that could not be commanded but only earned. These were officers who had observed his transformation over the past 6 months and who had benefited from his new approach to leadership and mentoring. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a young officer who had initially been wary of Marcus based on his reputation but who had become one of his most enthusiastic supporters as she observed his genuine commitment to inclusive leadership. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, "I wanted to thank you for recommending me for that advanced tactical course. I know it wouldn't have happened under the old system." Marcus smiled, understanding that Lieutenant Kim was referring to the traditional approach where such opportunities typically went to officers who fit certain demographic profiles rather than those who demonstrated the greatest aptitude and potential. "You earned that recommendation through your performance, Lieutenant Kim. My job is just to make sure that performance gets recognized." As he continued toward his office, Marcus reflected on how many conversations like that one he had experienced over the past few months. Officers and enlisted personnel who had felt overlooked or undervalued under traditional leadership approaches had flourished under the more inclusive environment he had learned to create, and their success had contributed to overall improvements in unit performance that had impressed even the most traditional senior officers. The evening found Marcus at his desk, working on the outline for the service-wide training program that would represent the culmination of everything he had learned from Riley about leadership, inclusion, and the transformation of military culture. The program would teach other officers the lessons that had cost him so dearly to learn, hopefully preventing future incidents like the one that had nearly destroyed his career while promoting the kind of leadership that brought out the best in every service member. As he wrote, Marcus thought about Riley's deployment and the classified missions she would soon undertake, missions that would benefit from the collaborative leadership skills they had developed together. He thought about the junior officers who would benefit from the training program he was developing, and about the future military leaders who would grow up in an environment that valued capability over appearance, potential over prejudice, and character over conformity. The night that had begun with his catastrophic misjudgment of a small woman in civilian clothes had ultimately led to his becoming the kind of officer he had never imagined possible, someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to impose one's will on others but from the wisdom to recognize and developed the unique strengths that every person brought to the mission of defending their country.